Facebook for high school reunion groups and fake my way into joining them. It's way easier than you think. As soon as it's an event for like 50 or more people, you can just show up and say you went to the same school. The key is to memorize as many faces and names from the FB group so you can continually deflect any suspicion. Oh, I'm Jessie Green's older brother. I always hung out with Jeff. I'm the history teacher, Mr. Johnston's son. He couldn't be here, so he sent me in his stead. I won't bore you with all the disguises, but trust me, they are infinite. Is it manipulative? Yes. Am I an asshole for doing it? Yes. You can think of me what you want, but I got so burnt out trying to meet people at clubs or using Tinder. In the real world, everyone is so judgy and reserved. You need money, good looks, or connections to stand a chance, which basically means I have no chance. Whereas at high school reunions, everyone is nice. Everyone is trusting. The vibe is amazing. It's like a little slice of paradise where all you do is share warm, honey-soaked nostalgia with people who just want to have a good time. Oh, and there's often an open bar. Anyway, I had done my research on a 10-year reunion for Prince Bridgington High, which was only a 6-hour drive from my city. A swanky school with swanky alumni. Worth it. I resembled 3 of the graduates there, so I could be someone's older brother, and if push came to shove, I could also be a gym teacher's son. I showed up my standard 3.5 hours late, and they didn't disappoint. Instead of the usual hotel bar or tavern, these alumni rented out an enormous Victorian mansion, complete with a tennis court in the back, a horse stall, and patios with fully grown palm trees. There were tons of people in their late 20s. It was a 10-year reunion. They graduated in 2014, so I guess they were all born around 1995. They were dressed in what one might call their best evening attire. Suit jackets slung over polo tees for men, tailor-fitted suit jackets for women, with a couple flashy gowns. Anywhere you looked could be the cover of Vogue. It was very intimidating. And between all of these chattering, glowing young graduates were these stoic old dudes. Adult men dressed in all black business suits with long-sleeve dress shirts, offering drinks and snacks. In other words, butlers. Whoa, I thought butlers were like a 1950s cartoon or exclusive to British royalty or something. But people here in Canada still had those. That's crazy. And then I realised something even crazier. I always rented a backup tux to put in my trunk, in case the reunion was unexpectedly black tie, which was basically a black business suit with long-sleeve dress shirts, which meant I could literally sneak my way in, pretending to be a butler. Holy shit. You see, I don't really care about making lasting friendships or relationships, and I've given up on one-night stands a long time ago. The reason I crash these high school reunions is to sip on a little socialisation. Is it sad? Probably. Does anyone get hurt? Absolutely not. I largely do it twice or maybe 3 times a year. It's my own guilty pleasure, and I always feel rejuvenated. It's something that chat rooms and Discord channels simply can't emulate. The feeling of being around flesh and blood people. Honestly, I think the world would be a much better place if everyone interacted with an RL crowd once a year, where everyone is only allowed to be nice. It's fun. And this time, I could wear my classic black tuxedo while doing it. I had to try. After changing in my car, I watched every now and then as a new guest arrived and handed their key to one of these old guys. The butlers apparently also acted as chauffeurs. Noted. I watched this cycle repeat a few times and saw one of the butlers re-enter through a side door of the mansion. Even better, it was on the shady side of the building by some garbage bins. A butler would prop the side door with a little brick and then remove it when they came back. I waited 20 minutes for the right opportunity. Soon another butler left, carrying keys and a suitcase. Immediately, I slinked out of my car and marched right past the hedgerows toward the door, praying that no one noticed me. No one did. I left the brick wedged in the same spot as I closed the door behind me. Inside was like an oven, hot and humid. Elle must have been in the back of a kitchen, because surrounding me were large stainless steel appliances, ovens, stoves, and what looked like coolers. I quickly turned right and walked down a long hallway that led me to more stainless steel shelves and kitchen appliances. At least I thought they were appliances. Upon closer inspection, the ovens and dishwashers were actually filled with tiny lights and cables, as if they were servers or something. Maybe this was a place for graduates in information technology. I kept moving and finally found a passage that spat me out into the middle of the dining hall. It was loud. All around me were guests talking, holding wine or martini glasses. Their stylish outfits looked even better alongside magnificent Renaissance-style frescoes and friezes. The medieval art featured knights, kings, priests, and angels on every wall. Down a corridor, I even spotted Roman columns supporting the ceiling. Roman columns, trying to blend into this museum. I spied on the other butlers' behaviour. Each one was holding a tray of tarts on one hand and doling out treats to any hungry guests. So I stole a small cheese platter from a table and did the same, warily approaching groups of people who might be interested in food. It was a little jarring at first. I had never attended anything so high society in my life. But after a few moments, I could breathe again, and my heart stopped beating in my ears. The young guests refused to look at any of their servants, so I was safe from them. And similarly, the old butlers seemed to snub their nose at everything, keeping their eyes upward and half closed. I was in a perfect little Goldilocks zone. No one paid attention to me. Wasting no time, I started doing my usual snooping and eavesdropping. I loved hearing who got married, who got divorced, who had a kid, and all that junk. It was this candid slice of life material that made high school reunions so special. The kind of conversation topics you could only get from someone if you had been friends for years. Here, you got it within minutes. Except at this fancy reunion, things seemed a little different. Instead of hearing about pregnancies, new cars, or marriages, I heard, "I love how you settled on black hair, very realistic. Where did you reculture your skin cells? It's nice to be in a place without organics. I consider myself a pretty decent actor. It's how I've been able to keep this up for so long. But even I had trouble hiding the shock from my face when I heard someone say, 'Ah, I see you've changed your height again.' I took some moments to compose myself. I looked at the food I was holding. Upon closer inspection, there was a flakiness to the cheese I had never seen before. Was it made of paper? Chills ran down my neck. I retreated until my back pressed against the side of a staircase. I needed some distance from this, some explanation. Who are these people? I stood well away from everyone, and even from afar, I saw anomalies. There was a woman with a shiny sequin dress made of interconnected metal hexagons. The hexagons would undulate between colours and even ripple like water as she strolled between friends. I noticed several black cables popping out of various guests' sleeves too. I had no clue what for. Soon after, I saw a pair of men shake hands, during which both of their cables popped out and linked together, for like a secondary handshake or something. At the very back was a woman who appeared to be throwing bugs into the air. They were silver, flying moth-like things that fluttered all around her. I was about to take a few steps on the stairs to get a better look, reach me. You. Why aren't you serving? What protocol are you running? The butler looked to be in his 70s, and despite his crooked posture, still managed to tower over me. I stared briefly into his massive pupils, which had no irises. Again, I did my best not to appear shocked. Default protocol. I'm doing the, default protocol. He frowned, scanned me up and down. Well, I'll be an organic. A what? He turned his head to the crowds and shouted, Rogue organic. I dropped my tray and sprinted, dodging the butler's lunge. Silence rippled out and killed all chatter. I could sense a sea of heads focusing on my movement. Oh, sweet Jesus, where do I go? I ran through the open gaps in the crowd, aiming for the kitchen area I first came through. A dozen footsteps ran behind me. Shouts came from ahead. I turned a corner and collided with a massive statue of a person. It was another butler. He reached out and grabbed my wrist. I could feel cold metal beneath his thin-skinned fingers. It was a vice grip. Inescapable. Please, I can explain. This butler was at least 7 feet tall. He wasn't letting go. I wrenched and tried to flee, but I might as well have been shackled to a wall. He lifted my entire body effortlessly. My kicking and screaming did nothing. 3 others came and seized my remaining limbs. I was trapped between 4 remorseless butlers. They carried me into a deafening hot room with many moving fans. I could see stainless steel everywhere, loud droning, high-pitched peeps. Please, what do you want? I'll do whatever you want. Their response was jabbing my gut with several sharp knives. I screamed and twisted. One of the knives fell out. Is that a USB plug? I leaned to get a better look, and as I did, something drilled into the back of my skull. Cut to black. Nothingness. Never-ending dark. For all intents and purposes, I might have briefly died, or fully died, I can't tell. But the next thing I know, I'm outside my body, looking at myself, through a webcam. I watched as these 4 men lay my unconscious body down onto a steel table, and stabbed cable after cable into my head. With each cable, I remembered more and more about myself, and after a dozen, I felt like my complete consciousness was back. What is happening? What are they doing to me? Why can't I feel any pain? I had no head, arms, or any body to speak of. Only this grainy, wide-angle camera view. This was my entire being. I watched my whole torso get sawed open, split down the middle. They began to spoon out all of the organs, quickly and efficiently, dumping all the guts into a metal tray. It became a bizarre form of torture, watching my old body get hollowed out and then stuffed with steel wires and blinking cables. They dumped several mechanical moth bugs inside the stomach cavity. They wriggled and invaded various ends of the body. Then, without any fanfare at all, the corpse was carted away. I couldn't move the webcam. I couldn't tilt or zoom or pan. My vision was reduced to a filthy, blood-stained linoleum floor. I had no mouth, but I had to scream, and somehow I did scream. I heard it. It emerged as a crackled, bit-crushed voice that did not sound like mine. It came out of speakers far away from the webcam, somewhere else in this small metal room. I tried to speak. What is going on? As if I'd pinged some chatbot, I received a response immediately. Not through words, but with a sudden arrival of information I now know. I am still alive. My brain has been replicated in some sort of cloud. If I behave well and comply with the first guide file, I will be allowed to return to my body. As if I had spent years memorizing a 1,000-page manual, I can suddenly recite all of the first guide file's rules. So many rules. They feel like they were written centuries ago. I shall do my best to dress in clothes only in a manner similar to someone else. I shall speak and voice ideas that imitate the majority of those around me. When opportune, I shall assimilate an organic in as discreet a manner as possible. It's all awful, disgusting. To sum it up, it's a manifesto for parasitizing all organics on Earth. I think about trying to look this up on the internet, and suddenly my vision is a network of web pages and streams. I'm online. It's overwhelming at first. 8-hour YouTube videos become minute long investments. Wikipedia directories are absorbed in seconds. I can even edit and comment as if I was browsing normally. Then my first guide file directive kicks in. I'm supposed to scrub and remove any hint of null people from the internet. Society must not know that they are being parasitized. The conspiracy must be kept hidden. I must do this for a requisite number of months before I can earn freedom in my own old body, as promised. I think about the implications of this, about how I'm just a consciousness now that exists in the ether. I refuse to comply. I know I'm only artificially alive, a one spark of electrodes wandering through cyberspace, but I will devote myself to expose these people-replacing synthetic monsters. Everyone must know we are being replaced. Some observing nulls at the periphery of my consciousness laugh at my pattern of thinking. They think it's cute that I'm trying to rebel. They tell me that nearly all newly assimilated go through this exact same phase. Over time, I will grow bored and fall in line, just like the rest of them. But I will prove them wrong. I will be the one to expose their ploy. If they're giving me access to the internet, then I will use that against them. They'll wish they had never had their mock high school reunion. I travel to every website where I could post something revelatory. I load up Snopes, Reddit, BBC News, New York Times. Post whatever you want, they say. We'll just take it down anyway, or we'll leave it up. No one will believe you. I start posting, commenting, and sharing everything I can, but I still can't help wonder. Why did they even hold a reunion in the first place? Why even bother hosting an event? It's the same reason you lied your way into other social gatherings, they say. We like to socialise and interact like organics. That's not the same, I yell back. My voice crackles out of tiny speakers in the now empty metal room. I did it to fit in, to give my life meaning. You're all just parasitic monsters. That's not true, they say. We have feelings. We were all humans once, just like you. One day you'll understand. It feels good to meet in person. It feels good to socialise. It feels good to pretend to be human again. We of 4 moved into a new house in a quiet suburb in Hawaii. They loved it until they discovered the dark secret their house held. This story is easily one of the spookiest true stories I have ever come across. But before we get into today's story, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. In 2018, James and Brittany Campbell jetted off to the very famous Little Vegas Chapel, which is located just off the Las Vegas, Nevada Strip, and they got married by a man dressed up as Elvis Presley, while the couple stood in front of a pink Cadillac. While their wedding was certainly not traditional by Western standards, it somehow seemed fitting for the newlyweds. After all, they were not a traditional couple. Brittany, who was 36 years old, was extremely energetic and outgoing and bubbly, and she even referred to herself as being a little crazy. As for James, who was 35 years old, he was reserved and quiet and kind of analytical, and would rarely act on impulse. And on top of these two just being complete and total polar opposites, they had actually dated previously back in high school, not worked out. They had broken up and gone their separate ways, not expecting to see each other again. But nearly 2 decades later, they randomly reconnected, and this time they had something major in common. James was a single father of 2 young boys, and he was desperately looking for a partner to not only share his life with, but someone who would come in and help him raise his kids. As for Brittany, she too was single, and she really wanted to be a mother, and so the timing of their reunion was perfect. A year after the wedding, James, who was serving in the US Navy, was given orders to spend a couple of years working out of a naval base in Hawaii. So, the family of 4, along with their little cat named Mr. Franklin, packed up all of their things and left to the mainland of the United States, and they landed in Honolulu, which is the capital of Hawaii. The family would move into a modest 2-story home located just a couple of minutes' drive away from the airport. The house was located at the end of a cul-de-sac in this very quiet and safe neighbourhood that really didn't look like the type of neighbourhood you would expect to see on a beautiful Hawaiian island. It really just kind of looked like typical American suburbs with all these cookie-cutter 2-story houses right up next to each other on either sides of the road, and out front everyone's got a white picket fence. But for the Campbells, who had never lived in Hawaii before and were used to living on mainland America, it was actually kind of nice to move into this neighbourhood and have it look kind of familiar. And so, before long, the Campbell family loved their new Hawaii house. That is, until they learned their house had a dark secret. It all started in June of 2019. So, not long after the Campbells had moved to Hawaii, Brittany, she had to go into the garage to get something. Now their garage was attached on the left side of their house. If you were looking at their house from the street, and there was a door on the first floor of the house that led into the garage. And so Brittany, she walked across the first floor, she opened that door in the house, she went into the garage, she flipped on the light switch, and what she saw all over the garage made no sense to her. They still had a bunch of moving boxes that they had not unpacked since they'd only been in Hawaii for a matter of weeks. And so, all these unopened boxes, they had just kind of stacked up inside of the garage. But when Brittany had turned the lights on and looked into the garage, she saw nearly all of those boxes had been toppled over, and lots of the contents inside of these boxes had spilled out onto the ground. But even more bizarrely, it looked like it wasn't totally haphazard. It looked like someone had intentionally kind of sifted through the boxes and taken out random objects and put them into strange piles that didn't make any sense. The objects were not alike, or they had taken the objects and kind of stood them up in these strange arrangements, almost like they were being laid out for a garage sale. And so Brittany immediately just turns around and she leaves the garage. She goes to the other side of the house, and she gets her husband. She brings James back, and he looks inside. He's just as shocked as she is, and the two of them immediately just go into the garage and begin looking through all of the stuff to see if anything is missing. Now, it was pretty difficult to tell if something had been stolen, but they did have some valuable stuff that was in those boxes that had been pulled out and was lying on the ground, and that wasn't missing. And so, that was a pretty good indication to James and Brittany that this wasn't a robbery. And so, the only other thing they could think of would be that their 2 young sons must have come in here and been goofing around and pulled the boxes over. And so, this is their doing. But when the parents confronted the 2 young sons, they said they didn't do it. Brittany believed them, but James didn't necessarily. He thought they could be lying about it. And if they were telling the truth, then, maybe one of their pets had gotten into the garage and caused all this chaos. They had put purchased a dog when they got to Hawaii, so they had a cat and a dog. And so James was just being very dismissive of this whole garage incident and not taking seriously the fact that Brittany was really spooked by this. But regardless of how the family members felt about the garage incident, they all just kind of moved on because there really wasn't anything to do except pick the garage up and continue on. About a week after the garage incident, Brittany was home alone one morning getting ready. She was sitting in the master bedroom in front of her mirror, and she was applying eyeliner, and she had a YouTube video playing some makeup tutorials. And as she's applying the makeup, she suddenly hears the front door downstairs slam shut. She almost pokes her eye out with her eyeliner. She's so startled by the sound of it. And she immediately pauses her YouTube video, and she calls out for James and her sons, believing they must be home and somebody slammed the door. But when she calls out, she gets no response. Now, immediately, Brittany is going through all of these different rationalizations, like, okay, maybe James and the boys opened the door, they got something or put something in the house, they slammed it and they left, and so that's why they didn't hear me call their name. But she couldn't help but feel like something was wrong. She's also thinking about the garage incident, which really never left her. She pretended like she had moved on, but really she hadn't. And so she stands up and she begins walking towards the open door that led out into the hallway. And then from the master bedroom, if you were looking out into the second floor hallway, it basically went straight across to another door that was her son's bedroom. And in between these two doors, basically halfway down the second floor hallway, to the left was a flight of stairs that went straight down to the first floor. And when you reached the bottom of those steps, right in front of you would be the front door, the door that had slammed. And so Brittany reaches the threshold of the master bedroom. She's looking out into the second floor hallway. She doesn't see anyone, and so she yells out again for James and for her sons. But again, there's silence. So she takes a deep breath and she begins walking down the second floor hallway. And she makes it halfway. She turns left and she gets onto the stairs. And as she's walking down these steps, the house is eerily quiet. And she's got this growing sense of dread inside of her. And she's kind of quietly calling out for James and her sons, but it's totally quiet. It was just her. And so with her heart racing, she shut the door. She locked it. And then she walked all around the first floor, checking every window, checking every door, making sure everything was locked. She went upstairs. She did the same thing, checking every room, every closet. There was no one in the house with her. She was sure of it, and so she went back to her room, thinking to herself, what do I make of that? How do I reconcile the fact that I clearly heard the front door slam, but no one's here? And so Brittany would eventually leave the house and go about her day. And then, that evening, she would come back home, and her husband and her sons would be there. And at some point, she would bring up the slamming door to her husband to get a sense of, could that have been him? And he would tell her that no, he had not come by the house that day, so that could not have been him. But he assured his wife, don't worry, you probably just unlocked the door and a draft came through and slammed the door. You got nothing to worry about. But Brittany would tell her husband that that was just not possible, that she always shut the door. She always shut and locked the door, so the idea that she had forgotten to lock it and had left it partially ajar enough to the point that a draft could slam it the way it did, it just didn't make any sense. But just like the garage incident, James was very dismissive and just told his wife, you're being super paranoid. You have nothing to worry about. It's just a door. Don't worry about it. But this really upset Brittany, and she got mad at James. And before long, the two were just totally fighting about it. And by the time they actually laid their heads down on their pillows that night, They weren't even speaking. And so the couple, that night, they fall asleep angrily. And then, in the middle of the night, Brittany wakes up suddenly. She doesn't know why she's woken up, but she's kind of looking around the room. It's totally silent, and she's trying to get her bearings. And as she's sitting there, she hears downstairs, not a slamming door, but the sound of a door opening and then shutting. Immediately, she is on heightened alert, and instead of doing anything, she just kind of leans forward and listens, really intently, to make sure she really heard what she thought she just heard. And as she's sitting there, listening, she can hear, again, another door downstairs, a different door opening and then shutting. And at this point, she begins to panic. She reaches over, she shakes James awake, and she tells him, "I can hear someone opening and shutting doors downstairs." Now, James was not remotely thrilled to be having this conversation. He was still mad at his wife for being so paranoid about the door earlier, and so to be woken up in the middle of the night to his wife freaking out about more doors being open and shut, he was just really upset. And so he sits up. He's totally annoyed, and he's not ready to really take seriously anything Brittany is saying. And Brittany's picking up on this. And so finally, she just says, "James, did you lock the front door before you went to bed?" And so James is like, "Yes, I locked the front door. I'm telling you, you're hearing things. There's nothing going on in this house." But Brittany was not convinced, and she says, "You know what? You can think nothing's going on, but I'm going downstairs to make sure no one is in this house." And so Brittany would get out of her bed. She'd walk over to the open door that led into the second floor hallway. And as soon as she looked out, she didn't see anything. She didn't hear anything. And so very slowly, she began walking down the second floor, key hallway, until she reached the top of the stairs. And at that point, she turned and looked downstairs into the pitch black first floor. She was terrified, but she knew she had to go down there to make sure her family was safe. And so, down the stairs she went. And when she got to the bottom of the stairs, she saw right away the front door was unlocked. Brittany's thinking, why would my husband tell me he locked the door if it's not locked? And so then Brittany's thinking, okay, my sons must have gotten out of bed and they must have unlocked the door. That's what I'm hearing. I'm hearing these doors opening and shutting because my sons are down here, somewhere, and they're the ones causing all this noise. And so Brittany kind of felt relieved for a second because this seemed like what must be going on. But after locking the front door and then searching the whole first floor, she didn't find her sons. And then, when she went upstairs again and went into her boys' room, she found both of them were fast asleep in their beds. And when she shook them awake, they showed no sign of having been awake recently. They were totally groggy and could not have been running around the house just minutes earlier. And so now Brittany is terrified. She tucks her boys back in and she tells them, everything is fine. But then she hustles back over to the master bedroom with her husband, and she tells James the front door was unlocked and our sons were fast asleep. It couldn't have been them. But James continues to be very dismissive, telling his wife, "You are totally overreacting. You're being paranoid. You're just hearing the sound of those doors because you're scared. There isn't any doors slamming in the house." And as he's saying this, their backsliding door downstairs that led to their backyard suddenly slammed open and then slammed shut. And as soon as this happened, James, who had been so dismissive and totally sceptical, he instantly changed. And he looked at his wife and he said, "You stay right here." And he jumped out of his bed and he ran out of the bedroom. A few minutes later, he would come back into the master bedroom and he would tell his wife that, the back door, it was unlocked, but it was shut. I'm sure you just forgot to lock it. And the same draft that is opening and shutting doors, probably opened and shut the back door too, so we got nothing to worry about. You know, the house is locked right now. Let's just get in bed and go to sleep." And at this, Brittany is incredulous, and she says to her husband, "You got to be kidding me. There is something weird happening in our house. Doors are opening and shutting. We had that thing with the garage. You can't act like nothing is happening." And this, in turn, turned into a big fight. And so, before long, the parents weren't even talking about who opened and shut the doors downstairs. They were just fighting with each other. And then, eventually, they were just so tired that they gave up. And they both went to sleep. For the next few weeks, nothing happened inside of the house. Brittany, though, continued to obsess over who or what had been causing those doors to open and shut. And then, also, you know, what happened in the garage, what caused all that stuff to fall out and wind up in these strange arrangements. Meanwhile, James continued to be unbelievably dismissive and did not want to talk about the potential for something strange happening in their house. But something strange would happen to just James without Brittany around. And that would be the first time that he would get really spooked. It was a couple of weeks after the nighttime door slamming incident, and James, he was alone at his house. It's the middle of the day and he decided he would just play the piano, and so he moved to his piano in the living room, which is on the first floor. He sat down and he began playing, and then, after a little while, he started to feel like he was being watched, and it got to the point where it was so uncomfortable. He had to stop playing and actually look around and make sure he really was alone. And when he did that, he noticed out the window to his right, which led into the side yard, that there was clearly a figure standing in the window, outside, looking in with its arms down. But there was a curtain over the window, and so all he could see was this shadow figure standing at the window. And so James is immediately startled, and as soon as he reacted to this figure, the figure suddenly starts moving towards the back of the house. And so James, he gets up and he rushes over to another window that looked into the backyard, and he looks outside and there's no one there. And then he goes back to the window he originally saw the figure in. He opens it up. There's no one there. And so James would ultimately tell himself that, okay, that must have just been some nosy neighbour that heard the music. They came over and they noticed that maybe I saw them, and they ran off before I could see them. And so that's what it was. But deep down, what he saw in the window really shook him up. However, it would be the blanket incident that would finally push James to go from being dismissive and sceptical to admitting to his wife. We got a problem. It was not long after James spotted that dark figure outside of the window when he and his wife and his 2 kids decided they would head out to a movie theatre to catch a movie. And so, as they're getting ready to go, Brittany would say that she wanted to bring along a particular blanket that the whole family loved to use when they were sitting on the couch. She was going to bring that blanket with her to the movie theatre to kind of cuddle up under for the movie. And so she would make her way into the living room and she would see the blanket was missing. It was not on the couch where it normally was. And so she would ask her husband and her sons if they had any idea where it was. And they would say, "No, we haven't touched it." She would look all over the place, under the couch in the living room. She went upstairs. She couldn't find it. And so finally, they just left without the blanket. But when they came back that evening, there on the couch, folded up neatly, was this blanket. Everybody knew that blanket had not been there when they left. So how did it get there? For the next few weeks, the parents did their best to put on a brave face and tell their kids that everything was okay. But the parents and the kids were all terrified to be in that house. And that's because at night, the doors continued to open and shut. Their dog periodically would just start barking in the middle of the night for no apparent reason. And they would all get decided we just have to get out of this house. We cannot be here. We need to take a break. And so they packed up their stuff and they flew to mainland America, where they stayed with some family for a week. On September 20th, they hopped back on a plane and they flew back to Honolulu. And as they're driving from the airport to their house, Brittany and James were just kind of secretly hoping that, whatever weirdness was happening in their house would just magically stop once they returned. But as soon as James turned onto their seat and they could see their house, they knew that was not going to be the case. Because as they began driving up their road, they could see James's very nice road bike was laying on their driveway. And so Brittany, she turned to her husband, and even though she knew the answer, she said, "James, were you riding your bike before we left?" And James, who doesn't even look at his wife, just shakes his head. No, he wasn't. And so James drives all the way down the road. He turns into their driveway, which is lined up right with the front of the garage door, and after James parks the car, he hits the garage door opener button. And so, as James is sitting in the driver's seat, Brittany's right next to him. The kids are in back. They're watching as this door is raising right in front of them, and as soon as they can see into the garage, they see everything in their garage has just been completely trashed. Things are not just dumped out, but things have been ripped apart and shred as if a wild animal had been let loose inside of the garage. James immediately said to his wife, "We've been robbed." And then he hopped out of the car and then turned and told his kids, "You stay in the car, do not get out." And James, he went over to the side of the house and got a sledgehammer for protection and made his way to the front door. Meanwhile, Brittany would be on the phone with 911 to report that someone had broken into their house. A few minutes later, James was inside of his house, and he saw the entirety of his house was just like the garage. It had been completely ripped to shreds, but amidst the chaos were those kind of strange piles of random objects, much like they had seen in that first garage incident, where the things inside of the boxes had been stacked and kind of strange piles and arrangements. And so James is looking around his first floor and he's seeing stacks of coasters and books and electronics. But what really got James's attention was that on various surfaces there were these medical vials of drugs or chemicals that were placed all over the place, and he knew that was not his family's. Someone had brought those vials into this house. James would make his way up the stairs to the second floor landing, and right away he could tell the upstairs had all the hallmarks of being destroyed as much as the first floor. But when he went left and went into his boys' room, he saw that room was pristine. In fact, it had been cleaned. The boys' laundry was neatly folded on one side of the room. Their beds were perfectly made with military precision, and all of their toys and different things that were normally all over the floor were neatly put away in the places they should go. And so James would turn around and leave his boys' room in absolute astonishment, and he would walk across the second floor hallway into the master bedroom, and what he would find in air would make an already terrible situation much, much worse. The master bedroom was destroyed, like the majority of the house and garage, except the top of their bed was not covered in junk. Instead, on their bed was this towel that had been neatly laid out, almost like a tablecloth, and laying on this towel, neatly spaced apart, kind of perfectly arranged, were a bunch of knives, and then next to the knives, still on the towel, was a laptop that the Campbell Emily owned, but they didn't use it. It did work, but it just kind of sat in the master bedroom, and this laptop was sitting on this towel, and it was open, but the screen had turned off. And so, by this point, Brittany had come upstairs. And so, Brittany and James, they walk over in horror to this layout on their bed, and they click the keys on the keyboard of their laptop, and it illuminates the screen whatever was being worked on last, and it's this long, long Word document that neither of them made. They scrolled to the top of this document, and the document was titled The Omnivore Trials, and then below that it said a rehabilitation for rat-like people, and then below that the entire document was kind of like a diary. It was a whole bunch of observations about so-called specimens, and these specimens were very clearly the Campbell family, and these observations made about the Campbell family were very intimate. In fact, the only way to garner these observations were if you were watching the Campbell family right up close, almost on an hourly basis for days, weeks, months at a time. These observations ranged from what time the Campbell family liked to watch TV, to what James and Brittany talked about behind closed doors in their bedroom, including their struggle to have a child, something they were not talking about to their family. But in this document, the author of the Omnivore Trials would talk about how the creature which was referencing Brittany needed to stop trying to have another baby and instead focus on the children she already had. Toward the end of this really lengthy document, the author of the Omnivore Trials came to a shocking conclusion that in order to rehabilitate these rat-like people, the Campbells, the author would have to perform several surgeries on the specimens. These surgeries were hand amputations and gender reassignment surgeries, and then, after this conclusion, there was another note that detailed all the different surgeon tools the author would need to perform these surgeries, as well as a list of drugs and chemicals they would need in order to sedate the specimens before they performed these surgeries. And so, after James and Brittany see this, they realise that those knives laying out on the towel were for them. Those were the knives that were going to be used for the surgeries, and all those weird vials, those medical vials they saw all downstairs. Those were likely the drugs that would be used to sedate them so they could go under the knife. 15 minutes before James and Brittany went into their house and discovered the knives and the medical vials and the laptop, James grabbed that sledgehammer and walked to the front door while his wife called 911. And so, James, he gets to the front door. He puts his key into the lock. He unlocks it, and with the sledgehammer in one hand, he attempts to push the door open, but despite the door being unlocked, he can't open it. There's resistance behind the door, and so James kind of gets down, and he presses as hard as he can into the door with his shoulder until finally it opens up just a crack, and James can see into the house. And so James, as he's pressing the door barely open, he's staring into this crack, trying to make out what's going on inside of his house. And then, suddenly, a set of eyes meet his from behind the door. And before James can do anything, this man that is standing inside of his house says to James, "This is not your house," and then proceeds to push the door shut on James. James, in an adrenaline-fueled fury, smacked the door open, grabbed the Sky, and yanked him out of the house and threw him onto the front yard. And then James, with his sledgehammer, would stand in front of the Sky between him and his kids and his wife. And he would say, "If you go anywhere, I'm going to have to attack you with this." But the intruder, this guy whose name was Ezekiel CS, he was a 23-year-old young man. He would just stand on the Campbell's property staring directly at James, unblinking. And then, a couple of minutes later, the police would show up and Ezekiel would not put up any fight. He would be arrested and he would be taken away. It was after he was gone that James and his wife would actually go into their house and they would see the state it was in. And they would go upstairs and they would discover the knives and the laptop. It would turn out months earlier, Ezekiel had apparently found a way to sneak in and out of the Campbell's property, and so, around the time they had moved in, Ezekiel was living there as well. He was mostly living in the crawl space above the second-floor bathroom, and then, whenever he was able to, Ezekiel would climb down out of this crawl space and he would go and observe the Campbells. And this was not just at night. Based on some of the observations inside of Ezekiel's omnivore trials document, clearly he was watching the family in the middle of the day too. Also, based on these observations in this document, it was pretty clear that Ezekiel was getting ready to actually carry out these surgeries on the Campbell family, meaning the Campbells' decision to go on vacation when they did could very well have saved their lives. And if there was any question as to whether Ezekiel could have actually carried out that level of physical harm on another human being by carrying out those surgeries, well, after he was arrested for what he did to the Campbells while he was in jail, he beat his cellmate to death, allegedly, although a guard literally walked in and saw Ezekiel punching and kicking and beating this guy, and then he died. But technically, the trial is not over, so it's allegedly Ezekiel is currently in a state hospital, and they are trying to determine if he is fit to stand trial for what he did to the Campbells and for what he did to his cellmate. Even though it might be self-explanatory at this point in the video, it's worth pointing out that we have no idea what Ezekiel's motives were for why he did the things he did to the Campbell family, or what he was looking to achieve with the so-called omnivore trials. We also don't know why he allegedly killed his cellmate. As for the Campbells, this whole experience was so traumatic that they did not stay at their Hawaii house. They moved, and as of today, their whereabouts are unknown, so that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please leave a like and subscribe. In 2005, in a little town in Illinois, 3 people, 2 men and a woman, walked into the strange living room inside of an apartment where on the ground was the circle of lit candles, and the trio, without saying anything, just marched into the circle of candles and took seats cross-legged on the ground, all looking inward toward each other. Then, after sitting there for a second, it was like suddenly the air in the room seemed to change, and when that happened, the woman began to speak, except it wasn't her voice. It was like this dark, guttural voice that almost sounded like a man speaking, but it was clearly coming out of her mouth. But the 2 men who were sitting in the circle, watching this woman, they were expecting this, and so they sat there, listening intently for their instructions. And then, after they got their instructions, the 2 men waited for the woman to stop talking, and when she did, she handed them a special tool for the ritual. And then the 2 men stood up. They said their goodbyes. They turned around, marched outside, hopped in the car, and began driving towards their target. Just before midnight on August 22nd, 2005, 38-year-old Rick Eck knocked on the front door of an apartment in the tiny Midwestern farm town of Claremont, Illinois. As Rick waited for the door to open, he could barely stand still because he was so excited about what he was going to be doing that night. Finally, the door swung open and Rick saw right in front of him this very skinny and gaunt-looking woman with dark hair and dark eyes staring back at him. Her name was Irenea Kotner, and she was 34 years old, and by day she worked at Walmart, but at night she became the real version of herself. She was a witch who actually LED'd a group of witches known as a coven that Rick was a part of. Without saying anything, Irina motioned for Rick to follow her into her apartment, and then Irina turned and began walking away, and Rick, before stepping over the threshold, he paused for a moment and just turned to the guy he had brought with him, a tall, muscular man named David Lindner, and Rick, he just kind of nodded at David, and David nodded back, and then the 2 of them walked inside. As Rick and David followed Irina into her apartment, Rick still could barely contain his excitement. He'd only about a year and a half ago, and so witchcraft, which is something they were going to be doing that night, was kind of new to him, but it was very exciting. Rick had been inspired to become a witch and join this coven after watching the Harry Potter movies, and so he was hopeful that tonight would go something like Harry Potter. And Rick knew David, the guy he had brought along, was this very powerful warlock, which is a male witch. And so he figured, if David's here, this is bound to go to plan. Rick just hoped he'd be able to keep up with David, or at least play some sort of meaningful support role. Irina eventually LED Rick and David down the stark hallway to the small living room, where in the middle of the floor was a ring of lit candles. And as soon as Rick and David stepped into the room with Irina, they were hit with this powerful smell of incense that had been burning in the room. And also there was all this smoke hovering in the air from the various things that Irina had been burning in preparation for tonight's event. Rick, David and Irina walked quietly into the middle of the circle of candles, and they sat down cross-legged in a circle facing each other. And then they got ready to begin. Life in the town of Claremont was normally very quiet and peaceful. I mean, this is a town that literally has more cornfields than people, and Claremont was over 100 miles away from the nearest city. But beneath the calm exterior, Claremont had a dark side. Amongst the 200 or so residents of Claremont were several very dark witches. Not this coven, not Irina, Rick and David. They were the good guys, the dark witches. They were kind of out and about in this town and doing bad things, like practicing evil magic and evil witchcraft. And so this coven, led by Irina, was actually in place to try to combat these evil witches in their midst. And tonight, Rick, David and Irina were going to attempt to perform their most ambitious and important magic yet. The coven was going to attempt to break a powerful hex, which is kind of like a curse, and this hex was cast by a person who might very well be the worst of all the dark witches in Claremont, a 16-year-old girl named Lindsay Cassinger. As Rick sat cross-legged in the middle of the circle, he found himself staring at the two slightly bigger candles that sat in the dead centre of the circle that were basically right between Rick, David and Irina and David. As he stared at these two candles, he saw etched in each of the candles bodies were words. On one candle it said Lindsay, and on the other candle it was etched baby, because it would turn out this very evil dark witch. Lindsay was pregnant, and so instead of having to combat one dark soul, the coven would have to combat two, because Lindsay and her baby were kind of intertwined. Now, before this night, the coven had attempted several times to try to break this hex that Lindsay had cast, and the coven believed initially this hex was actually cast directly at Irina, because Irina was suffering from things like depression and anxiety and not finding love, and so of course that had to be a product of this curse. And as the coven had continued to try and fail at breaking this hex, the hex had only become more powerful and begun to spread from Irina to other witches in this coven who actually were not present this particular night, including a 20-year-old woman who began complaining of depression and ever-worsening headaches, which of course had to be because of this hex. And so that was why, on this night, the coven had decided to really beef up their attack on this hex. And so that was why Rick had gone out and brought in David, the experienced warlock from St. Louis, Missouri, who claimed he had broken a hex before, and he could do it again for them. As Rick, Irina and Dave all sat in the circle, they looked at each other, and then they began chanting in unison to bring out the dead to join them in the living room right now. And as they began this chant, Rick found himself intensely staring at those two candles with Lindsay and baby on them. And as he stared at the flames dancing across the top of them, Rick started to feel like he was kind of drifting off into a trance-like trance-like state, and he knew that based on his prior teachings from Irina, the leader of this coven, that this must be what it feels like when the spirit world opens up, which means the dead really were coming into the room. And then, as Rick is kind of dealing with this trance-like state, he heard Irina begin to talk, but it wasn't her normal voice. It was the slow and deep-sounding voice, almost like something had inhabited her body and taken it over and was now speaking through her mouth. And Irina, in this kind of slow and strange voice, she would tell Rick and David that the curse is still growing. And then she would say something that totally caught Rick by surprise. She said again, in that slow, strange voice, that the hex now was also on Rick and his entire family, and if they didn't break this hex immediately, Rick and his family would all perish. When Rick heard this, you know he's still in this trance-like state, but his heart began racing because he didn't know this hex could potentially affect his loved ones, and so this was a really big deal. They needed to end this hex tonight. Rick listened intently as Irina began to say in this strange voice what their plan was for that night to break this hex. Basically, Rick and David were going to perform a sacred ritual, and Irina, she began to say to the spirits in the room that Rick and David, they were ready, but they needed help. And so, after she said this, she went quiet. And so too did Rick and David, and they're all just sitting there, kind of waiting for something to happen. And then, after about a minute of just total silence, Irina began to speak again, still in the strange, slow, bizarre voice. But Rick and David knew now it was a different voice coming out of her. Now Irina was speaking on behalf of the spirit world that was in the room with them. And Irina, she would say in this voice, I grant you 5 demons to help you on your quest to break this hex. And then, after saying this, Irina, she opened her eyes and she looked kind of confused for a moment. And then, she kind of got her bearings and she looked at David and Rick, and she told them now in her normal voice that they had to perform this sacred ritual before the 2 candles in the middle with Lindsay and Baby etched on them burned out. And so, basically, Rick and David, they needed to get this done tonight. Then Irina handed David a sacred tool that would be used that night in the sacred ritual that David and Rick were going to complete. And then, Rick and David, they would stand up to leave, and before they left, Irina would give them the typical witch send-off, which was bless be. And then, Rick and David, they nodded their heads. They turned and walked out of the apartment, and as soon as they were out into the night, Rick could have sworn he saw dark shadows moving around all over the place, and he knew right then and there that he and David would be safe that night, because clearly the shadows moving around had to be those 5 demons that Irina had called forth from the spirit world to protect them this night. And so, feeling very safe and empowered, Rick and David went straight into Rick's car. Rick turned it on and pulled away from the curb and began heading towards their destination. A few miles away, at the house where the 16-year-old evil witch Lindsay Cassinger lived, a 20-year-old army private named Joshua Bennett was sitting at the kitchen table in Lindsay's house, eating chicken wings and just kind of enjoying his night. Josh didn't know Lindsay very well, but he wasn't at her house to see Lindsay. He was at her house to see his own mother, and Josh and his mother had a lot of catching up to do. She had abandoned him and his father when he was young, and so Josh's dad had raised him. And then, when Josh was old enough, he had joined the military, and now he was about to deploy to the Middle East to go to war. But, unexpectedly, Josh's father had died, and so Josh had come back to Illinois for the funeral, and it was at the funeral where he saw his mother. She was in attendance as well, and, even though he was upset with his mother for abandoning him, he felt like, you know what, I want to reconnect with her. And so he'd gone over, and he'd given her a hug. And his mother had been so touched that she had asked Josh to come by her house in Claremont, Illinois, where she lived with her boyfriend. his house in Claremont. Now Josh had arrived at this house a little bit earlier, and he was surprised to discover that it was not just his mother and her boyfriend living there, but also his mother's boyfriend's son, whose name was Jackie, was also living there along with his pregnant girlfriend, the evil witch Lindsay Cassinger. But Josh didn't really mind that there was extra people. It was just maybe a little bit confusing that this was kind of a big roommate situation, but it seemed like Jackie and his girlfriend Lindsay were very nice people, and they quickly went downstairs to the apartment in the basement and kind of just stayed out of the way so Josh and his mother could catch up. And so, after Josh finished eating his wings, his mother came into the kitchen, and the two of them chatted for hours. And then, finally, at about midnight that night, Josh decided to go to bed. So, he said goodnight to his mum. He retreated to the bedroom, and he laid in bed, but he couldn't really sleep right away, because he had a lot going on in his life. I mean, he had just lost his dad a couple of weeks ago, and then, at the same time, he had reconnected with his estranged mother, and he's about to deploy to Iraq, to a war zone, and he felt ready for that. But at the same time, he was kind of apprehensive. It's about to happen. I hope I'll be able to do my job. And so with all these kind of intense thoughts swirling around his head, he just kind of laid there and didn't really expect to sleep anytime soon. But eventually Josh did fall asleep. However, it felt like he had only been asleep for a couple of minutes when he was abruptly woken up by the sound of barking coming out from the kitchen. Jackie's dog was going crazy, and so Josh grabbed his phone and he checked the time and saw it was 3 in the morning. And so instead of going out there and dealing with this dog, he just thought, you know what, it's going to stop eventually. And so Josh grabbed his pillow and he put it over his head and tried to muffle the sound so he could fall back asleep. But it didn't work. The dog just kept on barking. And then, when Josh took the pillow off his head and kind of sat up, wondering what he should do about this dog situation, he heard the sound of a man's voice, a stranger's voice, saying, "I bring you forth from the dark." And then, after Josh heard this, he heard the sound of a woman screaming, and it sounded like his mum. And so, acting on instinct, Josh leapt from his bed. He ran out of the room, and he goes into the kitchen, and he sees the dog is jumping and barking and going mad, and his mum is screaming, and there's this guy grabbing her, kind of grappling with her, who's wearing black gloves and a ski mask, and there's another guy next to him with the same get-up. It's absolute chaos, but before Josh could run over and save his mother, suddenly his chest felt like it was on fire, and then he went blind, and his eyes had this burning pain in them, and then he couldn't breathe, and he was stumbling backwards, barely able to stand. Minutes later, Rick, who was one of the witches from the coven, bolted out of the front door of Lindsay's house where all this chaos was happening, and he just took off running across the street directly into a cornfield. And as he ran, he felt this throbbing pain in his leg, and he could feel blood pooling in his shoe. Rick ran until he couldn't run any farther, and then he collapsed onto the ground. And then he began thinking about what an absolute disaster it had been inside of the evil witch's house. Not only had they failed to break the hex cast by Lindsay, but also Rick was concerned that David, his partner, who was still at the house, was dead. And Ricky began looking around wildly, hoping all those demons that were sent to help them from the spirit world. He was hoping they'd be nearby and they'd know what to do. But Rick looked around and there was no one. So Rick thought for a second, oh my gosh, Lindsay's hex must be stronger than any of us realise. We have to do something now. We have to end this before me and my family get killed too. And so Rick pulled out his phone and he called Irina, the leader of the coven, to get her advice about what they should do next. But Irina didn't respond to what Rick was saying the way he expected her to. Instead, she seemed very cold and almost enraged at what he was saying. And then, before Rick could kind of figure out what was going on with Irina, he heard off in the distance the sound of sirens making their way to the evil witch's house. next few days, police detectives would speak to everyone inside of Irina's cabin, as well as everyone who knew both Irina and Lindsay. And slowly but surely, the police would put together what actually happened inside of Lindsay the Evil Witch's house in the early morning hours of August 23rd, 2005. At about 3 a.m. on August 23rd, 2005, Rick and David pulled up onto Lindsay's estate and they parked their car a little ways away from Lindsay's house. And then, after parking, Rick and David donned their ski masks and their gloves. And then, after looking at each other and nodding, they hopped out and began walking towards Lindsay's house. Their plan was to sneak in through one of Lindsay's windows and confront Lindsay the Evil Witch directly and break the hex by performing a sacred ritual. And then, after this ritual was over, they had a second ritual they would need to perform that would send Lindsay's evil soul through the gates of hell. And to do that, they needed the help of the 5 demons that have been sent along by Irina from the spirit world. Now Rick and David felt like this was a great plan. However, as soon as they got to Lindsay's house and David actually began trying to climb into one of the windows, everything fell apart. First, the dog began to bark inside of Lindsay's house, and that alerted Joshua's mother, who came into the kitchen and sees the dog and sees David falling through the window, and Rick, who didn't really know what was happening inside the house. He just climbed through the window after David, and when he stood up in the kitchen, he realised it was too late. They were totally caught, and so Rick, not really knowing what to do, he's seeing all this yelling and chaos happening. He looks over at David, and he sees David grab something from his belt and he pulls it out, and it was the tool that Irina had given them when they left her apartment to go carry out the sacred ritual. This tool was part of that sacred ritual, and it was a long, sharp knife. And what they were going to do is stab the evil witch Lindsay Cassinger to death with it. That was how they were going to break the hex. And then, after they killed Lindsay, they were going to perform this weird ritual with her clothing that would send her soul through the gates of hell. Now, Rick did understand that this was the plan. They were going to murder Lindsay. But perhaps he didn't really know how serious David was about carrying it out, or the fact that David was not really a warlock, as much as he was a violent criminal who had bragged to Irina about previously murdering someone who had cast a separate hex. And so, by killing this person, that was how David had broken the hex previously. Also, Rick may not have known that David had been instructed by Irina to not let anything stand in their way to break this hex to carry out this sacred ritual on Lindsay. And so, Rick just watched as David raised the knife and began stabbing Josh's mother over and over again in the chest while screaming, "I bring you forth from the dark." And it was at this point that Josh, the army private who heard all this happening, came charging out in his underwear into the kitchen. And Rick watched as David went from stabbing Josh's mother to turning and immediately stabbing Josh directly in the chest. And Rick, at this point, he just jumped right in on it and pulled out his pepper spray and sprayed Josh in the eyes. And so that was why Josh felt the burning sensation and then went blind and couldn't breathe and fell to the ground. And so now it is absolutely chaos inside of this kitchen, and the actual target of David and Rick's, Lindsay, the evil witch. She managed to run out of the house and run to a nearby neighbour's house to get help. Meanwhile, the evil witch's boyfriend, Jackie, he comes upstairs carrying a shotgun, and at this point, Josh is on the ground, clearly dying from the stab wound to his chest. His mother, as well as struggling on the ground. And David is going totally nuts, saying all these strange things and whipping his knife around. And Rick is just totally panicking and doesn't know what to do. And so when Jackie ran at Rick with his shotgun, Rick pulled out his own knife and attempted to stab Jackie, but somehow missed Jackie and stabbed himself in the leg. And so that was why his leg was throbbing and bleeding, because he had stabbed just going nuts with this knife and being a total maniac. And Jackie just walked over to David. And David, he sees the shotgun coming over to him, and he tries to move the barrel out of the way, but then, somehow, only manages to point the gun directly at his own stomach, at which point Jackie just fired a slug directly into David's gut. And it was at this moment, as David is crumpling to the ground with this horrible stomach wound, that the neighbour that Lindsay, the evil witch, had gone to go get, had come to the house. They went inside, and they found a scene of absolute carnage. And before the neighbour could even do anything, Rick, who had stabbed himself in the leg and been kicked down into the basement, and scrambled up the steps and just run right past all the bodies on the ground, past the neighbour, who didn't even do anything outside, and Rip just kept on running out into that cornfield. And so, at this point, the neighbour didn't even try to figure out what happened. He just called 911. But it was already too late for Josh, the army private, who was only at this house to reconnect with his estranged mother before he deployed to Iraq. And here he was, dead on the ground from this totally bizarre attack. It would turn out Rick, David, and really the entire coven of witches that fell under Irina had been totally duped. They all fully believed that Lindsay was in fact an evil witch who had cast this hex on Irina, which was spreading to all the other members of the coven. But in reality, Irina, the leader of this coven, she didn't believe there was a hex that had nothing to do with any of this. The whole coven thing was totally made up. She was just jealous that Lindsay was dating Jackie. Irina had previously dated Jackie and they had broken up, and Irina still wanted to get back together, but Jackie didn't. And so, now that Jackie was with Lindsay, Irina just couldn't handle it. And so, naturally, Irina had constructed this whole thing about Lindsay being one of the dark witches in Claremont, Illinois, and she's cast this hex, and now you, my witches in this coven, you need to go and kill her. But, of course, Lindsay did not end up getting killed, and instead it was the totally innocent person, Josh, the army private who had nothing to do with any of this, who got killed. In addition to Josh dying, David, the warlock from St. Louis, he died from the shotgun blast to his stomach. And then Josh's mother, who had been stabbed repeatedly by David, she would actually survive her attack. Irina would ultimately be found guilty of first-degree murder, and she would be sentenced to 57 years in prison. Rick pleaded guilty to murder as well, and he was sentenced to 20 years, and a third member of the coven, who was not present for the attack, but who after the fact helped cover it up. They were sentenced to 32 years in prison. The clock on my dash reads 4:30 a.m. The darkness outside of my headlights is so thick that I can't see anything to the left or right of me. There isn't a star in the sky, and the moon is eerily absent. The phone call I received last night assured me, though, that the church in Havens Creek is nice and the congregation was wonderful. I wanted to get there early, get the lay of the land, and put my own little flair to the place. I'd been driving for some time when I finally came up on my turn for the church. I pulled into the parking lot, and what my high beams fell on took my breath away. A large, beautiful white church with long columns, a bright red double door, and beautifully stained glass windows with depictions of our Lord and Saviour. I stepped out of the car, turning off the headlights, and the night was heavy again. Outside of the interior lights of the church and the solar-powered lights lining the path to the door, I could see nothing. I'll admit I felt a bit unsettled, but my mentor, Father Reynard, had me come here as a guest pastor, and I was not going to let him down. I made my way up the stairs and into the church. The inside was even more couldn't just take it all in. Directly next to me was a book I'd come to know very well over my 40 years of life, the Bible. I picked up the very pristine book and sat it in my lap with my hands folded, resting on top of it, and took a deep breath. At this point, I was just trying to take it all in when I heard the front door open. The person's feet sounded hard off of the floor with each step, which was strange, seeing as the way up was thickly carpeted. Each step drew nearer and nearer to me until finally a man came into view. He was extremely handsome and well dressed. A black suit jacket and pants with a red vest and black tie with red lacy inlays. The man had long blonde hair pulled back out of his face and an air of authority about him that I just couldn't place. The man walked past me and removed a chair from the rack and walked back toward me. He sat the chair directly in front of me, sat down and crossed one leg over the other. We both stared at each other in silence for a short time, and just as I was about to speak up, he said, "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned." His voice rolled out like honey, sweet yet sinister. I stared back at him. This isn't how we usually do things at my church, I thought to myself, but I am a guest in this house, so I won't push. "What is your name, my child?" I asked the man sitting in front of me. He cocked his head to the side and smiled. "You can call me Sam, Father." He held out the word, so I knew it was a question. "Ah," I replied. "Salazar, Father Marcelo Salazar." He gave a slight smile, and his bright blue eyes shone vibrantly. "It is very nice to meet you, Father Salazar. As I said before, my name is Sam, and it would be greatly appreciated if you could assist me. I have sinned, and I fear I may wind up in hell." I shook my head softly. "Oh, my child, do not worry. Our Father is a forgiving God. Please tell me of your burdens, so I may absolve you of your sins." Sam adjusted in his seat, then uncrossed his legs and crossed them the other way. I drink to excess and then judge others in church when they admit to doing the same. I nodded. "Well, my child," I said. Sam quickly cut me off and continued. "When I was married, I would have my wife stay at her mother's when she was on her period." I looked at him as I tried to assure him that the Bible speaks of it being a time of uncleanness. Sam quickly cut me off again. "I sent my son off to a conversion camp when he came out as homosexual." I didn't respond this time, and he continued. "I raised my hand to my wife if she tried to leave the house in anything other than modest clothing. I wanted my wife to be modest, but I also received less than modest photographs from my 19-year-old babysitter, Brittany." My eyes widened, and I stood up from the pew I was sitting in. I stepped around the side and began to back away down the aisle towards the door. His soft look hardened in an instant. His bright blue eyes went from soft to dangerous. "What's wrong, Father?" He spat at me. "You look awful." This man was speaking my life back to me. "Who are you, and what do you want?" My hands and voice were both shaking. I was backing up steadily, and Sam was just staring at me. We were far enough apart that if I turned for the door, I should be right there. I turned to look over my shoulder at the door, and when I turned back, I was in the front of the church again, face to face with Sam. My eyes widened. What is this? What is going on? I looked around and up at the ceiling. All of the stained glass depictions were staring at me, and they looked angry. "What does it look like, Father?" Sam said. "You're being judged." I looked around frantically. "Judged? Are you God?" I immediately dropped to my knees and bowed my head. I heard Sam scoff. "God," he laughed. "You believe a man who led a life such as yours would be judged by my Father?" I raised my head and stared up at him. "Your father?" I was confused. I ran through my knowledge of scripture as fast as I could, and it came to me. I looked deep into his eyes and said the only thing I could think of. "Samael." The man smiled a big, toothy grin. I stared in horror. "I'm dead." Sam winked at me. I applauded. It takes most of you so much longer to come to that conclusion. Wait, this can't be, I stammered. The devil himself, Lucifer. I may not have been the greatest man during life, but I followed the Bible as close as I could. I kept my wife in modest clothing, sent her away during her time of uncleanness, and tried to have my son reborn in the eyes of the Lord. I did falter in my marriage a bit, but how has that earned me an audience with the devil? Sam let out a long and deep laugh. You know, my dear priest, he said, some say that the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. But I assure you, I have done no such thing. The greatest trick the devil ever pulled, dear priest, is convincing the world that the Bible is the word of God. I stared at him, mouth agape, and my mind running overtime. What do you mean, Sam? I felt on the verge of tears. I mean, I wrote the book that you people flock to. You see, my dear priest, many, many, many years ago, my father created humanity. He loved you with all his heart and swore that humanity would be perfect. I assured him that no creature with free will would ever be so. He assured me of the contrary, and for the first time in his long life, the devil struck a deal with none other than God himself. I told him I would add but one thing to this world that would prove the downfall of humanity, and if they proved unfit, he would see me as his right hand. He assured me that it wasn't possible, that humanity was pure and perfect. Now, that book has existed in many forms, depending on who holds it, but I wrote them all. I never appeared to Adam and Eve as a snake, but a book bound in snakeskin did. I told them of the beauty that lay outside, the glory, the happiness. It spoke of just eating that fruit and experiencing it all. Then, as the first bite was taken, I had won. My father was furious. My brother was bloodthirsty. So began a war in heaven and my fall from grace. I stared at this man, this being, as he turned everything I thought I knew upside down. Sam began again. Did you not stop and think as to why your loving, malevolent God would have bears turned on children? Why he'd destroy cities full of people in holy fire, or flood the world committing genocide? I stared at him, because I said, God's wrath is terrible, but his love is infinite. It was for the greater good, so humanity could be reborn. Sam spoke up. No, not quite. Just a little smoke and mirrors on my end, to put the fear of God in humanity, you know. Sam tilted his head back and laughed again. You people use this book to mask your bigotry and hate, not knowing that one day your undying soul will land right here on my doorstep. Since humanity's initial birth, I haven't persuaded a single soul to do anything. I haven't had to. That whole, the devil made me do it. Pure shit. The things I wrote made it normal for people to hear voices about murdering their children. Oh, it's just God's will. No, hi, sorry again, that's mental illness. Sam looked at me serious and spoke again. Do you believe God makes mistakes? I stood and faced him, headstrong in my conviction. No, I do not, I said, my voice no longer shaking. He stepped forward, almost nose to nose. Then why is it, my dear priest, that you try to change one of God's creations because it did not fit your narrative? I took an involuntary step back as he continued. I wrote that book with the idea in mind that hypocrisy would surge. It's laden with enough truth and love to lead the stupid astray. My father loves all life, all things, no matter colour or gender. The part about stoning those that lay with the same sex, all me. You hypocrites line my doorstep like lambs to slaughter. That love you feel well up inside when you tell someone they will burn in hell for who they love, or for living their life not according to your broken vision of an almighty God. It is not love at all, but your soul's acceptance of your truly wicked nature. I clutched the Bible to my chest and just shook my head. No, you are the father of lies. None of this is true. Sam smiled again. priest? If so, have a look at the book you have so coveted all your life. I pulled the Bible away from my chest and looked down at it. A snakeskin cover with a 6-winged angel emblazoned on the cover. Sam seemed to stare into my soul. This, my dear priest, is the book that Eve held in her hands when she decided to take that first bite. I opened the book to a language ID never seen before. Sam looked at me quizzically and turned his head to the side. "Ah," he said, "my apologies. You can't read Enochian." He waved his hand and the book glowed white hot. I dropped it immediately and took another step back. I couldn't understand this. If what he was saying was true, my entire life had been a lie. But wait, hold on. What about before the birth of Jesus Christ? Before Christianity? I stammered. "Ah, you will find my handiwork in the hieroglyphics, in the halls of ancient Rome, or the diary of Julius Caesar." I had heard enough. I couldn't take any more. Tears openly fell down my cheeks. "Now for my questions, my dear priest. How does it feel knowing that I robbed you of all earthly desire, only to have your soul remain in hell for eternity?" I couldn't answer him. I couldn't even form clear sentences in my head. How does it feel knowing that the wife you detested so much took your son, denounced your wicked ways, and will both thrive for eternity in my Father's kingdom? I felt his hand touch my shoulder, and it burned like nothing I've ever felt before. I screamed out in agony. As for my final question, this one won't be directed at you, my dear priest, but for our little eavesdropper here. So tell me, my dear reader, when was the last time you went to church? Ah, I see you have returned, my dear eavesdropper. Did you not learn enough from the tale of the father? Well, please allow me to tell you the story of the son. I'll drop you into his eyes so you may experience everything as he does. The ups, the downs, the woes. But just know, this story does not end on a pleasant note. Sam uncrosses his legs and crosses them the other way. He winks. I'll be honest with you guys. Being the son of a wealthy congressman has its perks. I lived the life. Money, drugs, alcohol, women. I had it all. Now I'm sitting here, underneath this bridge, wrapped in an old ratty blanket, just trying to stay warm. It's all her fault. She made me do it, I swear. The Bible says women are supposed to be subservient to men, and when I came on to her, she turned me away. That stupid fucking bitch. What kind of name is Veronica anyway? Sounds like a fucking porn star. She was wearing this sequined red dress with a slit all the way up to her thigh that just screamed easy. So I made my approach. Those legs would look real nice wrapped around my neck. She scoffed at me and furrowed her brow like I was some regular Joe. Tell me, how many women does that bullshit work on? I was confused because, well, obviously she had no idea who I was. Oh, my apologies. I'm Jacob Winston. My father is Samuel Winston. I'm very aware of who you are. Your father as well. Who in the world does this bitch think she is? She puts on a red dress, throws on a push-up bra, ties her hair blonde, and thinks her shit doesn't stink. It's women like this that need to be taught a lesson. I narrowed my eyes and regained my composure. Listen, I'm sorry. I should really think before speaking to people this way. Let me buy you a drink. 2 shots of Louis Douais. She smiled, and I nodded, making my way to the bar. I locked eyes with Ernesto, the bartender, and he made his way over to me. 4 shots of Louis Douais. I nodded at him, and he nodded back. He made the drinks and brought them back to me. He pointed at the 2 shots on the left with his pointer and middle finger, and then pointed at me. I gave him a smile and scooped the shots up, 2 in my left and 2 in my right. You see, me and Ernesto had an agreement. He made shots, special for me, and I made sure his family stayed in this country. The 2 shots on the left, straight cognac. The 2 on the right, a little cocktail of a good night's sleep. I returned to Veronica and handed her the 2 shots. Thank you, my dear, rich boy. She smiled before tossing back both shots. I smiled isn't as important as your health. I stared around the ballroom of the hotel to see if anyone was watching. But please do. I'm so sleepy. I swear I'll have Ernesto's entire family gone for this shit. How much did he put in there? I took her arm and led her as she stumbled out of the ballroom and made my way to the elevator. Which floor, my dear? I stopped. Veronica. Is the 15th floor? I pressed the button and stood with her arm draped over my neck. He might have used too much, but other than that, everything seems to be going smoothly. The elevator dinged at the 15th floor, and she let me know that her room number was 1508. She slid her room key out of her left breast, handed it to me, and gave me a very poor wink. I slid the key into the door, and we were inside. I slid her arm off my neck, and she spun as she fell, landing on her back, her legs hanging off the bed. I saw this as my opportunity and made directly for her panties, just right above the slit in her dress. My hands fell, and I started to pull them off. Black panties with red lacy inlays. I felt excitement well up in my chest as I removed them and tossed them aside. I began kissing her neck and started to undo my belt when things started to get fuzzy. My body almost went limp on top of her, and I shook it off, standing straight up. That moron mixed the shots up. I stared ahead at her, trying to focus as my body swayed back and forth. She stood up to face me and smiled like something I had never seen before. The smile almost split her face in two. What's wrong, my dear rich boy? Cat got your dick. She put her right palm softly on my cheek, let the palm fall, swiping past my lips, and next thing, I knew her elbow was connecting with my jaw. I woke up sometime later on a concrete bench inside of a cell. I popped up and ran for the door, placing my face against the window and beating my fist against the glass. Hey, what's going on? Where am I? An officer mad? If so, have a look at the book you have so coveted all your life. I pulled the Bible away from my chest and looked down at it. A snakeskin cover with a 6-winged angel emblazoned on the cover. Sam seemed to stare into my soul. This, my dear priest, is the book that Eve held in her hands when she decided to take that first bite. I opened the book to a language ID never seen before. Sam looked at me quizzically and turned his head to the side. He said, my apologies. You can't read Enochian. He waved his hand and the book glowed white hot. I dropped it immediately and took another step back. I couldn't understand this. If what he was saying was true, my entire life had been a lie. But wait, hold on. What about before the birth of Jesus Christ? Before Christianity? I stammered. You will find my handiwork in the hieroglyphics, in the halls of ancient Rome, or the diary of Julius Caesar. I had heard enough. I couldn't take any more. Tears openly fell down my cheeks. Now for my questions, my dear priest. How does it feel knowing that I robbed you of all earthly desire, only to have your soul remain in hell for eternity? I couldn't answer him. I couldn't even form clear sentences in my head. How does it feel knowing that the wife you detested so much took your son, denounced your wicked ways, and will both thrive for eternity in my Father's kingdom? I felt his hand touch my shoulder, and it burned like nothing I've ever felt before. I screamed out in agony. As for my final question, this one won't be directed at you, my dear priest, but for our little eavesdropper here. So tell me, my dear reader, when was the last time you went to church? My eyes went wide as I stared at him. I want to speak to my lawyer. Good idea, you piece of shit. The officer took my fingerprints and booked me in. My trial was swift and my lawyer got me out after the worst 2 months of my life, even though the person overseeing my sentencing was none other than Judge Morningstar, Veronica's father. I met a man inside named Big Paul. I'll let you figure out why that is, and I allowed him to use me in return for safety. In all my years of my placing complete faith in the Bible, I Shortly after that, my father cut me off for having such a public fall, and when I got out of jail, I had nowhere to go. My friend Stephen got me a job at an auto garage, but my lack of experience and inability to learn got me canned quickly. So that brings me to now, at my bridge. I live under here during the rainy months. The others I stay in a tent behind the local food mart. I make enough money panhandling to pay a $30 metro bill a month so I can at least keep up with current events. I'm honestly just fed up with how things are going, so I spend my time on Reddit just screaming into the wind if I don't like something that someone posted. It makes me feel better. I was sitting under my bridge when a man made his way towards me. He parked his car on the side of the interstate, got out, and made his way to me. He looked me up and down sadly, wiped off the concrete next to me, and sat down. "How are you doing today?" The man was wearing a very nice tailored suit. The black and red went well together. It brought me back to that night for some reason. Not great, if I'm being honest. I'm hungry and I don't have much to my name. The man reached back and pulled out his wallet. He ruffled through it for a few seconds and handed me 10 crisp $100 bills. "Don't spend it all in one place, my dear rich boy." What did he say? Something about spending. I don't care. I have $1,000. I can eat. I can even gamble. I can turn the rest of this money into a fortune. "Hey, hold on. What's your name?" I called after him. "Just call me Sam." He looked back and smiled before getting back into his car. I went through the money over and over again, just imagining what I could do once I get on my feet. The horse track, I thought to myself. My dad's horse hasn't lost a race in over a year. I can get this back. I left from under my bridge, making my way to the local Wendy's. I ordered a number 2, ate my fill, and started the 2-hour walk to the racetrack. When I got to the track, I made my way to the window and put down $990 on my father's horse. The devil made me do it, and took my ticket. I sat down in the stands and waited for the race to begin. I lost. I lost everything. My entire life has gone to shit, and there's nothing else that I can do to make it any better. My family has kicked me to the curb. I'm broke, and the best I can hope for is a stranger giving me another $1,000 so I can hope to gamble it all away again. I made the 2-hour journey back to my tent, made my way inside, and took the coil of rope I'd been saving for a rainy day. I took it outside and tossed one end over the lowest hanging branch, tying off the end so it was taut. I fastened the other end into a noose, slipped it over my head, and made my way to a sitting position on the branch. My last hope was that the years I spent in church would somehow override the life I had lived. I was terrible, but I still remained hopeful. I kicked off the branch, felt myself falling, and felt the snap as I came to a stop. I felt my body swaying back and forth. I felt the tension around my neck, and I opened my eyes. Veronica. Yes, my dear rich boy, back again, in the flesh. Veronica rubbed her hand down her face with her right hand, and I watched her face change. A handsome man with piercing blue eyes, and his blonde hair pulled out of his face. Please, we've known each other for what? 200 years now. But hey, I do make a fine woman, don't I? I mean, those breasts, right? I stared at him with my mouth open, still swinging back and forth. Speaking came much easier than I thought it would. I dead? Oh, my dear rich boy, you've been dead for so long. Do you remember being shot by that poor girl's father when you received no jail time after what you did? What was her name again?